high priest and cut off his ear. And then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and He will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then should the Scriptures be fulfilled that it must be so?" At that hour Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out as against a robber, with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But all this has taken place that the Scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled." So, it's interesting that this takes place. John tells us that it was Peter, of course, that had this sword with him, and Jesus actually made sure that somebody had a sword, and Peter is the leader, of course. Well, if there's going to be a sword, I'm going to be the one that has it. And he pulls out this sword, and he cuts off, John tells us, the right ear of Malchus, the servant of the high priest. Now, what we don't know is, was Peter aiming for the high priest and actually missed and hit Malchus instead? Or was he aiming for Malchus's head and was such a bad swordsman that he actually, cut his ear off? Or, we don't really know, but it does kind of on its surface really kind of appear a little bit comical, doesn't it? Here's Peter, mighty man of God, and he's cutting off the guy's ear. That's going to really do a lot of good. I don't think he would make David's mighty men, or his list of 3 or 30 guys that were so good at warfare that they could, you wouldn't know they cut your head off until it hit the ground. I don't think Peter would make it in that number. And Jesus, I think, did this absolutely on purpose. Why? To show the futility of us trying to save Jesus or save ourselves. He says, okay, here's the best that you can do, guys, is you're just going to cut off this guy's ear. By the way, Jesus healed the ear, put it back on, so Peter would have been without accusation, because they could have arrested Peter for that, but they didn't. And Jesus says, this is ridiculous. If you're going to live by the sword, you're going to die by the sword. Probably a local proverb that he was quoting. In other words, you can't do anything to save me. I don't want you to save me. And you can't do anything to save yourself. All your efforts are just going to backfire on you. He says, look, if I needed help, I could ask for help, and help would be there. And he's talking about 73,000 angels at once. I tend to think there were probably at least 73,000 angels standing around there at the time. Remember the story with Elisha and his servant, and how the armies came in and surrounded him, and the servant goes, "Oh no, we're surrounded!" And Elisha prays and says, "Open his eyes." And surrounding the army was an army with chariots of fire. I gotta believe that those armies were surrounding the garden, and they were like just chomping at the bit. They were ready to go. If Jesus said the word about that fast, there'd be nothing left of any of those guys. Why do I think that? Well, in 2 Kings chapter 19, one angel in one night killed 185,000 Assyrian troops. That's one angel. Times that by 73,000, they don't have a chance. But see, that's the setup. Man in his best efforts can't save Jesus. He doesn't want him to. Man can't save himself. Jesus, although he had every opportunity to be saved, chose not to. It's all part of Jesus' plan. And here's the key. Jesus is offering himself. But he's not just going up to the altar, he is doing it through the agency of the condemnation of man. And he is purposely foregoing every and any right or ability that he has in order for man to take him and put him on that altar. I'm going to give you an idea of what I think might be going on here. And it has to do with the sacrificial system. In the sacrificial system, a man would come, and as part of the process, he would lay his hands on the sacrifice, thus transferring his sin to that animal. And then the priest would take the animal and sacrifice it, showing that the life blood of that animal was being shed for the covering of that person's sins. Well, here we have man laying his hands on Jesus, condemning Jesus to death, and in a way transferring their sin and guilt and responsibility onto Jesus, who then went up on the cross and shed his blood, not just for the covering, but the remission of all of our sins. So man had to have his hands in this condemnation and crucifixion that would take place. But Jesus was permitting it all. Jesus was behind it all. Don't think of Jesus as this victim. Oh, poor Jesus. He was being thrown around, and yes, it's awful. But Jesus was the one in control. That's what we need to get from this picture. So, let's go on here. Then, the end of verse 56. After all of this, it said, all the disciples left him and fled. Now, if you were reading with us last time, we saw the bravado of the disciples who said, especially Peter, of course, though all will leave you, I will not. I will even die for you if I have to. And Jesus, of course, said to Peter, before this night is out, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter, I'm sure, was thinking, absolutely no way. I got my sword. I'm pretty good with it. Right? But they all left. They all fled. Now, Peter and John, we know, didn't go far. I kind of pictured them hiding behind the olive trees, going from one tree to the next, hoping that they don't see him in the torchlight or whatever, following along behind. So verse 57, then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas the priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. And Peter was following him at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest. And going inside, he sat with the guards to see the end. Now, we know that Jesus was actually taken to Annas first, who was Caiaphas' father-in-law. Caiaphas had been the high priest, which was a position for life. But when the Romans came in and took over, they said, we're going to adjust and amend that rule. We're going to decide who's the high priest. And they took Annas out, and they substituted Caiaphas. They probably shared a courtyard in their homes. The people really recognized Annas still as the high priest, but Caiaphas actually held the office. And so Jesus came before Caiaphas, and before Annas first, and basically Annas questioned Jesus about his teachings. But Jesus simply answered that he could have found out exactly what Jesus was teaching if he'd just bothered to listen, because Jesus had been teaching it all over the place. And at that point, one of the soldiers struck Jesus, and then they sent him on over to Caiaphas. So Peter and John knew the family of the high priest, and he was able to get entrance for Peter and himself into this courtyard. And remember, street lights, there's no Roman spotlights coming down. It's just, some little fires, a few torches here and there. So the light is dim, it's flickering, so people aren't really as clearly defined. And Peter, I'm sure, is hoping that he can just kind of hide out. He can't, but we'll actually get to that next week. But here comes these trials. So Annas first, then sends him to Caiaphas. Now, in verse 59, now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last, 2 came forward and said, this man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. And the high priest stood up and said, have you no answer to make? What is this? What is it that these men testify against you? But Jesus remained silent. And the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus said to him, you have said so. But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his robes and said, he has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment? And they answered, he deserves death. Then they spit in his face and struck him. And some slapped him, saying, prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you? Wow. Pretty intense. Thing is, it was completely illegal. This should have never taken place.